Madison's famous quote at one point in the Federalist Papers is, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." But of course, we're not. And so that sort of practicality runs through so much of his thinking about what is good government for and what can it reasonably do to make people's lives better, and what it can't do, it shouldn't do.
Welcome to Being the Change, the official podcast of James Madison University, brought to you by Madison Magazine. Each episode brings you stories of how members of the JMU community combine intellect with action to live lives of purpose and meaning. That's being the change.
What's up, JMU? Andy Perrine here. Welcome to Being the Change. Today is another in a series of episodes that are surrounding the 250th celebration of the Declaration of Independence, which is the topic of the new issue of Madison Magazine coming out in May. And as part of the contents in the magazine, we asked several of our spectacular faculty with expertise in history, religion, philosophy, political science to pen a few of the articles in the coming edition. And with us today is Dr. Rebecca Brannon. She's a history faculty. And missing from this episode is Dr. Robert Brown and Dr. Kenneth Pierce. Dr. Brown is religion and Dr. Pierce is philosophy, and it was a scheduling snafu that left them out of this episode. So Dr. Brannon has generously accepted the offer of being solo in this episode. So Dr. Brannon, welcome.
Thank you.
It's
excited
great.
To be here.
I'm glad you're here. Well, the article that is in the 250th edition of the magazine is about James Madison and religious freedom. And, you know, while Madison was not part of the Revolutionary period, he was alive, but he was more important later in when the Constitution came together in the late 1780s. But the question of religious freedom was very much part of his early years, especially since he was such good friends with Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the statute that is engraved on his grave. He was so proud of it. But let's start with defining religious freedom. And that was kind of a new concept at the time, wasn't it?
It was absolutely a new concept, and it was one that Americans embraced as part of the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And what had existed before, what was the best thing on offer, was something called religious toleration. And I mean, all our listeners know, if I say, I tolerate you, I'm not being very warm and nice. I'm saying I will put up with your weird religious beliefs. And that's essentially what the state, meaning like any state, was doing. They'd say, well, those Quakers, they're kind of weird, but we'll let them have their own church and we won't harass them with the police. And as long as they pay tax dollars to whatever is the state-supported church, they can then give additional money to their own religious beliefs, and we will let them go attend those services, because a lot of colonies still had religious attendance. And so toleration would mean you could at least attend the services of your own particular faith, but you had to prove you were attending, and you could give your tax dollars to support whatever was the official church, but you were allowed to give more money to your own. And this was, by the way, considered really progressive for the 17th and early 18th century, really progressive compared to Europe, and was really popular with a lot of migrants from Europe who came to settle in the colonies, including in places like the Shenandoah Valley, who said, you know, this is better than being harassed for our religion in Europe.
Well, we've got a large Mennonite population in the valley, and they directly benefited from this diversity of thought.
Yes, absolutely. And they remember themselves to this day as people who were refugees who had to flee for religious freedom.
Well, and I think I remember that Madison was very heavily influenced by the Quaker community in Madison County being harassed.
He was influenced by that, but it turns out he was also influenced very much by watching the Baptists and the Methodists, who, newsflash, were actually a new approach to faith in the 18th century. And in Virginia, they were very popular, but they drew increasingly from people who were not the elite. The elite were often Anglican, and the Baptists and the Methodists really attracted people who were not. And then they found it really frustrating that they had to pay tax dollars to support the Anglican Church, and then come up with limited funds. And there had been struggles both over culture and politics, and that really shaped James Madison's sense of, hey, there are a lot of people with different religious approaches to faith, and why are we harassing them as a government?
So this is really kind of a revolution of thought, isn't it?
It is absolutely a revolution of thought.
Well, and the makeup of the colonies, too, probably influenced Madison's thinking, because a lot of people were refugees from religious persecution in Europe.
A lot of people were, and plenty of them came down the Great Wagon Road into Virginia. And lots of people were, seeking a better way to live in the colonies, and that better way to live could include a better approach to faith as far as they were concerned.
Now, Madison was influenced by a lot of thinkers, ancient and modern, in his time. And
the man loved to read.
He did, and in many languages, in fact. I think he learned Hebrew while he was at the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton, where John Witherspoon was the headmaster, who was a Scottish Enlightenment thinker. So there was a lot of different influences, but one of the main ones was John Locke, the 16th century English philosopher. Now, our faculty member, who's the Lockean expert, is missing our session today, but Rebecca is going to soldier on with us in discussing how Locke's influence on Madison and Jefferson really resulted in some of this new thinking.
Well, I like how you kind of tipped your hat to how much James Madison is a follower of John Locke's insights as reflected through John Witherspoon's. And it's foundational that he attends the College of New Jersey, which was already interested in religious liberty. But it also cemented what's a sort of Madisonian practical approach to government. Government is about creating the conditions for an orderly, meaningful, safe life for its citizens. It's not about solving all the loftiest theological problems of the world. And so if you can create Madison's famous quote at one point in the Federalist Papers is, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But of course, we're not. And so that sort of practicality runs through so much of his thinking about what is good government for and what can it reasonably do to make people's lives better and what it can't do, it shouldn't do.
That's essentially a very modern thought, isn't it?
Madison is a very modern thinker in so many ways.
Well, so I guess Locke kind of opened the door and Madison walked right through it. Well, Rebecca, there's a moment in your article that feels quite pivotal and maybe the midpoint of the movie about religious freedom taking shape in America. When Madison changes the language from toleration to free exercise, you mentioned this earlier, but one of the things that I think is very interesting to contemplate is that toleration actually implies superiority. And what Madison was doing was kind of leveling the playing field.
Absolutely. He's saying it is not for one of us to judge others, which, by the way, right there, I'm actually invoking how George Washington ultimately uses the language as president. But Madison is saying all are equal and all faith approaches are equal. Now, he had his prejudices.
Sure.
He wasn't wild about Catholics, but he absolutely...
Or atheists.
Or atheists, but he absolutely believed that, freedom of religion meant the free exercise, meant that the state was no longer making discriminatory choices between approaches to faith. And that opened the door. And the funny thing is, at the first time it comes up, George Mason, who's also actually a proponent of limited religious freedom, had written it in the more traditional way, and Madison pushes for free exercise, but George Mason kind of throws up his hands and says, sure, fine. So it's actually a change that's easy to persuade several of his fellow elites. This is the right time. If we really believe in freedom of politics, we really believe in all kinds of free exercise.
But not everybody agreed.
Oh, no, not at all.
And it took a lot of courage, and there was some conflict in the process, wasn't there?
There was a lot of conflict because for all the Enlightenment thinkers who said, this is great, what we really need to do is get the government out of the business of religion and religion out of the business of government and set people free in every possible way. And if we don't hold a gun to their head and tell them who to vote for or what kind of politics they want, we don't hold a theoretical gun to their head and tell them this is the way to achieve salvation. You agree, right? But if you're going to do that, if you're going to truly give people all this kind of freedom, a lot of people at the time were terrified that essentially humans are not very good. We would just fall away from religion if the state, meaning any government organization, didn't compel us. And there was a lot of fear that we would cease to be a religious or moral people if there weren't at least some government support and some government compulsion. And that was the great experiment of the American Revolution. Okay, let's put this idea in practice. What happens if we really do free the people from government compulsion? Will they still be moral? They would have put it as religious, but they also put it as moral because they did believe that a good government depends on its people being upright and moral. That's the only way you can have limited government, right? Government that doesn't try to control everything all the time. So Madison and others were optimistic that people would remain moral even if the government didn't make them. And others were terrified that if you didn't use force, the whole thing would fall apart. Why would anybody use their hard-earned money to support some ministers if the government didn't make them?
Well, and one of his more vocal opponents was Patrick Henry in this debate, who was advocating for the establishment of the Anglican religion in Virginia. And Henry was famously a terrific orator, and Madison was quite quiet and very intellectual. Describe for us how this prize fight started to take shape.
That was very nice of you to say Madison was quiet. He was not an orator. That's why he married well, listeners. Dolly was great at politics and socializing and did it all for Madison.
Dolly completed James, right?
That's right. But Patrick Henry, as you mentioned, it's bad luck to be on the other side of an argument from Henry because he was a great orator, but he was also quite passionate. And he was the face of it is a bad idea to free the people from religion too much. He had some sympathy with the idea that, the Baptists and Methodists deserve to live unmolested.
Right.
It was unseemly in a government to force too much. But he absolutely was particularly worried about ending government financial support. And in response, there is an effort by some mediating political positions to come up with some palatable compromise. And they say, okay, most of us don't like Catholics. Maryland is the Catholic state. We're not. Why don't we agree that all Protestant faiths could be equally funded? Now, that's not necessarily exactly what Patrick Henry wants, but he's a politician sometimes too, and when you get a good compromise, you better go with it. But there is this effort to say, why don't we just tax the people, have a pool of government dollars that are for religion, and any Protestant faith can access it.
Right.
And there are people wavering, interested in this compromise, and James Madison rejects it. He rejects it absolutely. He rejects it as government overreach, as inappropriate for the government to be involved in religion.
Well, you describe Patrick Henry as a wonderful politician, and this is one of Madison's early political experiences in that there was a sort of a war of pamphlets at the time, which is how these political discussions sort of carried forward. And he anonymously wrote this very famous pamphlet called "A Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments," and it really kind of won the day, and it got Jefferson's Statute of Religious Freedom to pass.
It did. Yeah. Well, if you're going to pick a fight with Henry, who's a great orator, you better have a different tool. And James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were both great writers.
Yeah.
Although I have to say, if you read them both, Thomas Jefferson is capable of being pithy.
Yeah.
James Madison's strong suit was never pithiness.
He was very elliptical.
Yes.
Not very quotable.
I enjoy them both,
right.
but let's be clear.
Right.
Madison sits down, and his genius is in careful thinking and in deliberate thinking and in writing through every possible scenario that might come up to prove his point. And that's exactly what he did. And as you say, he made the intellectual argument against using the power of the state's ability to forcibly raise money through taxes in the religious landscape.
And it won the day.
It won the day,
Yes.
and it won the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty.
Well, and now this kind of opens the door for, as we're getting into the Federalist period and the Constitution is coming together, and it kind of opens the door for the First Amendment. And Madison has done this great thinking, and he took what he learned in Virginia to the national stage. So it wasn't just a local victory, it became a national victory.
It absolutely did. Now, of course, that rests both on Madison being bright and persuasive, and the ideas being the right ideas for the right time. That the American revolutionaries were ready to be revolutionary on the subject of religious inclusion and religious freedom. And I make that point because sometimes when we measure the American Revolution by, did they really live up to the all men are created equal in every possible way? No, they often failed. Their imaginations failed and their political strength failed. But did they really have radical potential and live up to it? Mm-hmm. Yes. They bring people who were religious others, who had never been in the system, who were minorities, they bring them in. Technically, the First Amendment is in the Bill of Rights, which isn't part of the Constitution that James Madison helps write.
Right.
And one of the great political compromises is, of course, the Federalists agree to add the Bill of Rights in order to secure passage of the Constitution. But there in the First Amendment, we get freedom of religion spelled out. Beyond free exercise, we're now just at freedom of religion. And the idea being, as Madison writes, the government shouldn't compel people to pretend they believe things they don't, and the government should not force them to pay money for religion. And at the same time, the government shouldn't try to regulate theology, shouldn't tell churches what the right belief is or the right approach. And so it's getting religion out of government and government out of religion.
But these were religious people, though, so they also conversely believe that getting religion out of government would actually protect religion.
Absolutely.
Right.
They often cite history and the sorry history of religious conflict in Europe, which they were intensely aware of, including the 100+ years of war and destruction between Protestants and Catholics. And they say, how did that do anybody any good? What use was that? And it just made liars out of men. But so many of them are very religious people, and some are what we'd call deists, right? They believe there's an almighty God who shapes the world, but they don't necessarily believe that theological particularities between individual disciplines or approaches are nearly as meaningful as faith itself. But when I say they're radical, I mean, in the end, they don't stop at Protestantism, which would have been the assumption of their day. They make everyone equal under the First Amendment. And it helps to understand many of the states had laws on the books from the colonial period and early on that you couldn't vote if you weren't Protestant. Catholics and Jews, who were the other minority groups who they recognized, were there. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold office in many places. And all of this comes up at the Constitutional Convention. And actually, it comes up as a theoretical question. One opponent of religious freedom said, we really need to have a test in the Constitution, a religious test for office holding, because these were common. But you'll note there actually isn't one in the Constitution.
Right.
So it comes up at the convention. They say, well, what if a Mohammedan, they mean somebody who follows Islam, were elected? Would you want them in Congress? And expecting chaos. And instead, most of the founding fathers are like, recognizing that they consider this a largely theoretical question
Right.
at the time, say, well, sure, if the voters support that candidate, who are we to tie their hands? No office-holding tests of religion. And what's really radical about this is that it makes Catholics and Jews full citizens of the United States, which is not done. Jews were not citizens anywhere in Europe. When George Washington writes this famous letter to the president of a synagogue, who wrote this nice congratulatory note, so glad you're president, so excited for our new constitution. Did you guys really mean all that stuff about religious freedom and equality? And Washington greets him first with, my fellow citizen. You're citizens. And he literally says, it's no more that toleration is to be spoken of, as if it's something that one person can give another, or one class, he says, can give another. Nope, we're done.
Well, and if they were truly committed to the concept of popular sovereignty, which is ruled by the people, they had to, just through intellectual humility, accept the fact, with the exception of the enslaved and women at the time, that everybody mattered.
Everybody matters, and they are willing to live up to it in ways that were uncomfortable for them at times, different from how they'd lived.
Well, and this is kind of the essence of, and speaking of the Constitution, when the Constitution was being considered for ratification in the colonies or in the states, there was a great effort by Madison and Hamilton writing the Federalist Papers, which appeared in all the popular newspapers up and down the eastern seaboard, trying to make convincing arguments to allow for passage. And Madison famously in Fed 10, and this is one of the only quotable things that I think Madison has written, besides the If Men Were Angels bit, is that freedom is to faction as air is to fire. And the point he was making was, hey, don't fear faction because fire is destructive, but if you want to get rid of fire, you got to get rid of air. And that doesn't make any sense. So basically, he was opening the door for the modern concept of diversity.
Absolutely. And he is arguing that we shouldn't be afraid of faction, which we might call political party, but we also might call, he says, don't worry about a world with 10,000 registered lobbyists in D.C. Worry about a world with 2 who can get together behind closed doors and make all the decisions.
Right.
What protects us is all of those different interests jockeying with each other. And that's the point he makes in Federalist number 10. And it's actually a brilliant argument to, will the United States succeed or fail? And a lot of Europe was betting against us and said, nobody can have a democratic republic that's big and different. And he says, actually being big and different is what's going to protect us. You try to get the cotton planters and the rice planters and the factory owners who make 5 different kinds of products and the farmers who rely on vegetables. You try to get them all to agree on the same thing without making a compromise. Just try. And these are all real 18th century economic examples.
Right. Well, here we are today, 250 years after the Declaration and a few years less after the Constitution. I can't do the math. It was 11 years after, I guess. Why does this still matter today, Rebecca?
Well, we're still going as a democratic republic.
In the 250th anniversary, it's unbelievable. This experiment seems to have worked.
The experiment worked beautifully. We're still working on it.
Right.
They called it their experiment, and it's our experiment too. It's just a really long-running experiment.
Right.
And Madison was right. And I think they would also be surprised, pleasantly surprised, that their experiment in religious liberty worked.
Well, especially now because there's in terms of modern industrial nations, we're still a very religious country.
We're still a very religious country when you compare us to all the others.
Sure.
By the way, any way you want to measure it, we are by all of them. And religious historians love to make this point that what we created in the United States was a marketplace of religious ideas. And we said religion had to compete in the marketplace, just like everything else. And Madison's great insight when she argues for in the Federalist Papers is the Constitution creates a marketplace of democratic ideals. Our government has checks and balances, but it's a marketplace. Politicians have to go into it and convince us, and they have to argue with each other. That's a marketplace, right? And the marketplace of religion said, okay, government's getting out of it. You can build different churches or other buildings. You can choose your clergy however you want. You can have no clergy. You can do whatever. You get to compete for, to put it bluntly, butts in the seats. Figure it out.
Butts in the pews.
Right. Maybe if you're cynical, you say they adapted the theology to make it more palatable to people. If you're a little less cynical, you'd say they adapted the methods. They made the church maybe more of a community or more responsive to people's other needs, or they chose better orators to preach, or any of these things. In doing so, American religion became very successful.
Well, in this year of celebrating our founding, Dr. Rebecca Brannon, it's so great to have you on the show, and our listeners, I'm sure, are very appreciative of the wisdom that you dispense constantly to our students. So we thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for being on the show. All right, remember, listeners, if you've got an idea for an upcoming episode, you can reach us at beingthechange@jmu.edu. Until next time, go Dukes.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to hear more stories about how members of the JMU community are being the change. Dive deeper and explore countless other stories at jmu.edu/Madison Magazine. Go Dukes.
The Being the Change podcast was conceived by Jim Heffernan, editor of Madison Magazine, and me, Andy Perrine, head of JMU Marketing. Thanks to Jenna Polk and her team at the Rose Library Studios, where the show is recorded by Cody Troyer, Steve Adderton, and Olive Santos, all of the crazy talented JMU photo video team, who then produced the final episodes at the Ice House in downtown Harrisonburg. Original music by 2019 alumnus Neil Perrine. You can find the Being the Change podcast on all the popular platforms where we hope you'll like, share, and subscribe.